amendment. He says that the bill is $22 billion. Well, after the amendments that they're going to be offering on this bill tonight, CBO has scored it at $15.1 billion. It's clearly not what he is budgeting, what he is representing, so I just want to say that after the manager's amendment, which is the first amendment that we will be considering tonight, the CBO has scored this bill at $50.1 billion, which is a drastic cut to the needs of the American people. I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Wisconsin, a member of the Appropriations Subcommittee, Mr. Bocane.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. I'm in disbelief over the ridiculously low spending levels proposed by the Republicans in the Agricultural Appropriations Bill. They slash funding to 2001 levels, funding from over 20 years ago. That's a 41% cut, $10 billion to the people that feed America, our farmers. I don't see how any member of Congress who represents rural America can show this much disrespect to their constituents. Certainly no member from Wisconsin. Here's a few examples of what the bill does. It zeroes out the Dairy Business Innovation Initiative completely, from $25 million to nothing. That's assistance for new and growing dairy businesses that want to get products like milk and specialty cheeses to market. If you're an economically distressed farmer, of which unfortunately there are plenty, this strips assistance for 104,000 farm loan borrowers. If you're a farmer who uses the Farm Service Agency for things like loans or disaster relief, this bill cuts FSA in addition to conservation programs like EQIP that help farmers improve their operations and output. If you get energy assistance as a farmer, good luck with that. REAP fund will be cut by over $500 million, making your energy costs go up in rural America. And if you farm and supply food through international food programs, you're really out of luck because they cut it by $1.2 billion, a 69% cut. With this level of cuts, I would assume this was a satire, a Saturday Night Live episode. But it's just another Tuesday night in the U.S. Congress where farmers apparently aren't valued by the House Republican majority. No one who claims to support rural America could write or vote for an agricultural funding bill this bad. No one. And I, for one, won't be supporting this kind of disrespect to the farmers in my district. I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I guess it's fact-check time again for the American people. So FY 2000 was $14 billion. I think I demonstrated that 22.5 is more than 14. So the gentleman says, well, in FY 20, we're cutting it to FY 2001 levels. Well, Mr. Chair, that was 15 billion. Again, might be new math, but when I went to school, I was taught that 15 was less than 22.5. No matter how many times you say it on the floor of this House, we are not cutting spending to FY 2001 levels. We are cutting them to pre-COVID levels because, Mr. Chair, the pandemic is over. The freewheeling spending during the pandemic has to end. A $2 trillion deficit and an open southern border are existential threats to this country, and the Republican House majority is dealing with it. Mr. Chair, I remind the body that the Senate is not controlled by Republicans, and they haven't passed a single appropriations bill to the floor. Now, we only passed one, but again, when I went to school, one was more than none. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I yield 2.5 minutes to the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Baczynski.
Gentleman is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in opposition to H.R. 4368, which has been weaponized to further limit Americans' access to reproductive health care. Hidden in this bill is an attempt to reinstate medically unnecessary and outdated FDA policies that restrict access to mifepristone, a safe, effective drug used in medication abortion and miscarriage management care. From the courts to Congress, my colleagues in the majority are continuing their efforts to force burdensome restrictions that attack our fundamental freedoms to make our own decisions about our own bodies. This funding bill is yet another example of political interference into the scientific review process entrusted to the FDA by Congress. It is a draconian attempt to strip away people's fundamental freedom to make their own decisions, make their own medical decisions, rejecting years of scientific and medical expertise and an extensive evidence-based review that showed mifepristone to be incredibly safe. Mifepristone is safe, it's effective, and it's not the business of Congress to substitute political judgments for the judgments of the scientific and medical experts who determine FDA policy governing this medication. And what is even more unfortunate is that this is just one of many problematic aspects of this bill. As a member of the House Committee on Agriculture, I could spend hours with you all walking through how cutting funding to 2003 levels leaves our farmers and working families behind. I know my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who sit on the Agriculture Committee with me do not view this to be a serious proposal. And I challenge them to think long and hard how they will communicate this to farmers back home before voting yes on this bill. For these reasons, at the appropriate time, I will offer a motion to recommit this bill back to committee. If the House rules permitted, I would have offered the motion with an important amendment to this bill. My amendment would have stricken the provisions rolling back FDA's guidance. At the end of the debate, I will insert into the record the text of this amendment. I hope my colleagues will join me in voting for the motion to recommit, and I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Chair, first it was that we're cutting it to FY 2000 levels. Then it was 2001 levels. So now they raised the ante. It's FY 2003 levels. FY 2003 funding level in this bill was $17.55 billion. I will remind all the Americans watching that 17.5 is less than 22.5. In fact, we're $5 billion above that. We are not cutting spending to FY 2003 levels. Now, maybe the next speaker will suggest 2005, 2007. Now, if they get to FY 19 pre-COVID, yes, we are. Because the American people, and I want to suggest, the floor leader on the other side of the aisle said, Republicans talk of everything going up. Well, Mr. Chair, if that were true, if it's only Republicans that talk of everything going up, we would be getting 95% of the vote in America, because everybody is talking about everything going up. You can't go anywhere without someone saying, oh my gosh, I had to pay $4.80 a gallon for diesel. Oh my gosh, I got to pay $3.70 a gallon for, oh my gosh, I got to pay so much for milk. I got to pay $2 for a loaf of bread I used to pay $1.20 for. That's what Americans are. It's not Republicans talking about that. We're just listening to what the Americans say. That's why we're returning spending to the pre-COVID levels. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
We have no more speakers. And at this time, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Chair. Over the past 2 decades, our country and the agriculture industry have grown. Our population has grown. Yet this bill initially withdrew funding for America's agriculture, as you've heard, back to 2006 funding levels, with an allocation of $17.1 billion, which is nearly $8 billion below last year's enacted bill. Sadly, we are here tonight with a bill that the majority made even worse this past weekend by gutting Congress's commitment to American farmers, producers, rural communities, and families to levels last seen in 2001. This bill keeps moving in the wrong direction. Also, many of the amendments that we will be debating tonight, which lowering this allocation much lower than the American people need, will be an attempt really to circumvent the ongoing negotiations in the House Agriculture Authorizing Committee, which is working so desperate to get our farmers and our rural communities and our lenders in America a 2023 Farm Bill, which is the blueprint that our farmers and our stakeholders need to plan for agriculture in America going forward. This will jeopardize the consensus that we hope to build and to pass for the 2023 Farm Bill. So I urge my colleagues, defeat this bill. Let's send it back to committee, and let's begin to put together a better work product for the American people. This bill is a disgrace. It really does not rise to the level that the American people deserve. We have got to continue to keep our farmers and our Americans in a position to consume and produce the highest quality, the safest, the most abundant food and fiber anywhere in America, and to have the safest medications and the medical devices. So I urge us to defeat this. We need to do better.
Time has expired.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, the Republicans got sent back in the majority this term of Congress to get things in order in Washington. So in closing, I'd ask my colleagues to support the fiscal year 2024 Agriculture Appropriations Bill, which returns to pre-COVID spending levels and starts us on a path to decreasing our federal spending and decreasing inflation. That's what the American people want, but this legislation does prioritize critical programs that support our nation's farmers, ranchers, and rural communities. The bill importantly reins in federal spending and regulatory overreach, as well as includes a number of conservative policy victories to stop the Biden administration's woke agenda. Again, I would ask my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. The amendment printed in Part E of the House Report 118-216 shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. All points of order against provisions in the bill as amended are waived. No further amendment to the bill as amended shall be in order except those printed in Part F of House Report 118-216. Amendments in block described in Section 12 of House Resolution 723 and pro forma amendments described in Section 13 of that resolution. Each further amendment printed in Part F of the report shall be considered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equal divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, may be withdrawn by the proponent at any time before action thereon, shall not be subject to amendment except as provided by Section 13 of House Resolution 723, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. It shall be in order at any time for the chair of the Committee on Appropriations or her designee to offer amendments in block consisting of further amendments printed in Part F of the report, not earlier disposed of. Amendments in block shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for 20 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations or the designees, shall not be subject to amendment except as provided by Section 13 of House Resolution 723, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. During consideration of the bill for amendment, the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations or the respective designee may offer up to 10 pro forma amendments each at any point for the purpose of debate. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, pursuant to House Resolution 723, I offer amendments en bloc.
The clerk will designate the amendments en bloc.
Consisting of amendments numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 25, 26, 27, 28, 30, 31, 34, 35, 37, 39, 40, 44, 46, 47, 49, 50, 58, 59, 60, and 63, printed in Part F of House Report number 118-216, offered by Mr. Harris of Maryland.
Pursuant to House Resolution 723, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Harris, and the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Bishop, each will control 10 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in favor of this amendment. This is the bipartisan amendment which includes priorities from members on both sides of the aisle. I appreciate Ranking Member Bishop working with us on this amendment and ask for your support. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you. I rise in support of this amendment. This amendment includes 42 amendments, 5 bipartisan, 17 Republicans, 20 for Democrats. The agriculture funding bill has historically been a bipartisan bill, and we'll need to channel that same cooperation if we want to pass appropriations bills into law. I thank the gentleman for offering the amendments and his cooperation in having this bipartisan en bloc amendment. I thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Vermont, Ms. Balint.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the en bloc amendment, which includes my amendment to support Vermont's recovery from this summer's catastrophic flooding. Vermont farmers are hurting. With government funding running out on Saturday, the Republicans' agriculture appropriations bill is too little, too late. Vermont's recovery needs are urgent. My amendment urges USDA to ensure disaster assistance is deployed as quickly as possible. It's been a rough year in Vermont. Vermont producers have sustained millions and millions and millions of dollars in damages, impacting nearly 30,000 acres of land. Vermont farmers are essentially the heart of our communities, the fabric of our state, and I'll do everything in my power to make sure they have the resources they need to make sure that they are able to recover and build back better from this horrible flooding. A government shutdown would be devastating for Vermont and other states like mine that are recovering from disasters this summer. Vermonters need federal recovery dollars to continue to flow so that towns and households can get back on their feet. We must turn our attention to serious matters. I urge adoption of this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman from Georgia and Mr. Harris for working together. Every time I come to the floor, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to say I do not want a government shutdown, having been through them and seen the desperation that comes upon the American people, and I'll do everything I can that is within reason to make sure we do not have it. But as I present this amendment and thank the committees for allowing this amendment to be in, I just have to take note of the cuts in SNAP benefits, the funding cuts in rural electric cooperation, and the shocking cuts in WIC. That's what I think has to be fixed, and the American people are not aware. But I am grateful that my amendment, the Jackson Lee Amendment number 18, increases funding that provides grant, research, and financial support for the 1890s land-grant universities, which are 28 historically black colleges and universities. This amendment would decrease funding in another account. The Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities, Council of 1890s, includes all the historically black colleges. Under the Morrill Act of 1890, at least 19 universities have been designated. But the importance of this is how crucial it is to engage our universities in research. And in particular, the National Science Foundation, it strengthens the training of our young people. It provides them with the doors to opportunity. Research is the economy of the 21st century. Increasing funding for the United States Department of Agriculture that provides grant research would help to stimulate sustainable improvement in research and development. I ask my colleagues to support the Jackson Lee Amendment, supporting the education and research in historically black colleges. With that, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Glusenkamp Perez.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise today to urge the support of two of my amendments in this bipartisan en bloc. My first amendment supports farmers and healthy soils by asking the USDA to conduct research on the amount of microplastics in farmland. Microplastics are showing up everywhere in our bodies, in our waters, in our soils. And my amendment would support efforts to understand microplastics and support healthy soil, which is essential for our farming communities and our agricultural sector. My second amendment is the idea that the USDA should be able to fix its own stuff. We shouldn't waste taxpayer dollars on tractors and other farm equipment that cannot be easily repaired and by USDA technicians when it breaks. My amendment allows the USDA to be better stewards of taxpayer dollars and support the longevity of the equipment they use to perform groundbreaking research. I encourage my colleagues to support my amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman George is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I yield 90 seconds to the gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Ledger Fernandez.
Gentleman is recognized for 90 seconds.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I rise in support of this en bloc amendment, which includes two of my amendments. The USDA Office of Tribal Relations serves as the vital single point of contact for our rural communities as they work through what is available for them. And as we know, our tribal communities are rural, and they must have access to the USDA Office of Tribal Relations. My amendment number 4 would restore funding levels for the USDA Office of Tribal Relations. Separately, my amendment number 25 would increase funding to USDA Rural Development by $7 million to use these funds to improve its oversight of the Section 515 loan program for rural multifamily rental housing. Outrageously, in my district, 3 of these properties have experienced serious management and maintenance issues. The city of Espanola even condemned a property recently. This has left residents in unsafe conditions. USDA needs the necessary resources to make sure its properties are livable. The U.S. AG, but I must say, while I am in favor of this en bloc amendment, I must state again my opposition to the appropriations bill itself. I've previously stood on this floor in opposition to the severe cuts to our rural communities. We must prioritize our rural communities, not cut them to 2007 levels. So I urge adoption of this amendment, but opposition to the bill itself. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendments in block offered by the gentleman from Maryland. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The en bloc amendments are agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 15, printed in Part F of House Report 118-216. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 15, printed in Part F of House Report number 118-216, offered by Mr. Biggs of Arizona.
Pursuant to House Resolution 723, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of my amendment to restore funding for the USDA Office of the Chief Economist to fiscal year 2016 levels, which will save us more than $11 million in 2024. Now, what's interesting, I've been listening to my colleagues across the aisle say that it's going to 2001 levels. They don't want that. They don't want 2000 levels. This goes to 2016 levels, so I'm hoping that they'll support this, because our annual discretionary spending has exploded over the course of the COVID-19 response. No one thought our government was too small before COVID. We're currently spending $400 billion more in fiscal year 2023 for the same government we had before. And deficits for this year are expected to exceed $2 trillion. And that's why we have a $33 trillion national debt. And that does not even include the $600, $700 billion in interest that we pay. So revenue in fiscal year 2022 levels far exceeded our federal spending in fiscal year 2016, meaning that if we were to shrink the federal behemoth back to those pre-COVID levels, we might be able to avoid adding to our national debt for the next 12 months. This is the first of many amendments that I will be offering to appropriations bills this week, intended to reduce spending. My staff and I spent countless hours earlier this year reviewing prior year appropriation bills and making recommendations to the Appropriations Committee. I even filed 521 separate bills to cut spending across the discretionary budget, totaling $100 billion in spending reductions for fiscal year 2024. So I'm not singling any one office or department out here. We need to tighten our belts across the federal government in order to get spending under control. And so I'll just ask you, how bad is the national debt crisis? The 12 regional Federal Reserve banks that compose the largest central bank in the world have a monopoly on printing paper dollars. It's the world's reserve currency, and yet its ability to print money and invest it in bonds, the Federal Reserve is now on pace to lose over $100 billion this year. They lost $53 billion in the last 2 quarters. They're going to lose over $100 billion. And why is that? Because federal spending is out of control. If we're not going to fix it, who's going to fix it? Who's going to start fixing it? It's our job. I urge the adoption of my amendment, and I'll reserve.
Gentleman reserves.
Mr. Chair, I claim time in opposition.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I'd like to claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. The amendment would cut funding for the Office of the Chief Economist by an additional 46%. That's almost half. The Office of the Chief Economist provides advice and counsel to the Secretary on matters affecting the economy with respect to the Agriculture Department. This bill already guts funding for USDA. Any further cuts just make a bad bill worse. I just think we need to defeat this amendment, and I thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Harris.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to congratulate the gentleman, because the gentleman brings an amendment to the floor that does something with the $2 trillion budget deficit. And he's right, we have a $33 billion debt. Our interest payments in a few years are going to be over $1 trillion, more than Social Security, more than Medicare, more than Medicaid, more than food stamps, more than all of them. I just wanted one fact check before I sit down. Now we heard it was FY 2007, so I guess the speechwriters can't make up their mind. Is it FY 2000, 2001, 2003, now it's 2000? Just to remind the chair, the spending level in the 2007 bill was $17.8 billion, and that is almost $5 billion less than what we appropriate in this bill. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
This is a bad amendment. It's bad for the country. It's bad for USDA. I urge defeat of this amendment.
Reserves. Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the last while, I've heard my colleagues across the aisle, Mr. Chairman, they were talking about costs, that Republicans want to cut costs, and that we always talk about costs. But here's my question. What could they do? They're the ones who fostered this massive inflation on us that is imposing terrible cost on the American people. First thing they could do is they could unleash American energy. When you unleash American energy, you reduce the price of the fuels that are necessary for the farmers to produce our food. You reduce the costs for the transports to bring that food to market, and you make our cost structure go down. That's not necessarily inflation, because the other thing you have to do to bring inflation under control is to bring federal spending under control. I urge the adoption of my amendment, and I'll yield back.
Gentleman reserves back. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, when you cut the energy assistance programs for our farmers in our rural communities, you raise the cost of their production. And when you raise the cost of their production, you raise the cost of the products they produce on the shelves of the grocery stores. This is not a good thing, and I urge the defeat of this amendment. I urge the defeat of this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 24, printed in Part F of House Report 118-216. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 24, printed in Part F of House Report number 118-216, offered by Mr. Good of Virginia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 723, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Good, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Here we are trying to fund our government for the year at a time when we have $33 trillion in national debt and we're on track for a $2 trillion deficit this year. And so we are literally borrowing some $2 trillion to fund the government this year. So it's incumbent upon us to be careful with how we spend hard-earned taxpayer dollars. Mr. Speaker, within that context, the Biden administration continues to weaponize every lever of the federal government, abusing their power to push their harmful leftist agenda on federal employees and the American people. Exhibit A would be the Department of Defense abortion travel policy, which violates current law. But this harm that's being done to the American people by this administration manifests itself in other ways as well. And the Biden administration continues pushing diversity, equity, and inclusion policies through all federal agencies, largely enforced by the Office of Civil Rights. My amendment would reduce funding for the Office of Civil Rights within the USDA by 50%, permitting necessary functions to continue, but sending a much-needed message on behalf of the American people that they cannot use their taxpayer dollars to implement their radical leftist agenda. DEI initiatives promote hiring quotas rather than merit-based policies for selection and promotion. The federal government should be hiring and firing. There's a concept for the federal government. The federal government should be hiring and firing employees based on the quality of their performance or lack thereof, not based on the color of the skin or the gender they claim to be identifying as on whatever particular day. So my amendment cuts a little over $8 million. Again, when we're running we have $33 trillion in national debt and on track for a $2 trillion deficit. My amendment would cut a little over $8 million from the department so that taxpayer dollars can be appropriately used rather than promoting the leftist radical agenda of the Biden administration. And I yield. I reserve. I'm sorry.
Gentleman reserves.
Mr.
For
Chair,
what purpose does the
time
gentleman
in
from Georgia seek
opposition.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. This amendment would cut funding for the Office of Civil Rights at USDA by an additional 19%. The bill already cuts funding for USDA. Any further cuts would just make a bad bill worse. But the Office of Civil Rights at USDA is there for one purpose, and that's to make sure that every American has an equal opportunity to access the programs of USDA, regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of national origin. USDA over the past decades has been required to pay billions of dollars to folks who were stakeholders who were denied equal opportunity to access these programs. If we cut this, we will be hamstringing the ability of USDA to do the right thing. We want to stop this before it spreads. It's already done too much damage to access for minorities, for women, and for various ethnic minorities. So we must fund this office, and I urge my colleagues to reject this amendment. It's another amendment that does nothing to serve farmers, nothing to serve rural America, and it has no place in this bill. We should fund the USDA in a way that makes its programs accessible and available to every single American. I urge that this amendment be rejected. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, the justification that the gentleman from Georgia just enumerated there is already protected by law. It's already illegal to discriminate on the bases that he's talking about there. But thankfully, the Supreme Court, we are moving to a post-discrimination society. We're going to no longer discriminate based on race. The Supreme Court is moving us that way in education. We ought to be doing it with the Office of Civil Rights in the USDA as well. We should be using taxpayer dollars for those farmers and programs that actually benefit the American people and have the highest return, or at least a return, and one that's not harmful for the American people. If the Office of Civil Rights were simply ensuring that people were protected as required by law, again, there wouldn't be a problem, but the Biden administration has subverted these types of offices to promote their divisive, radical leftist agenda. And I reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Virginia has the only time remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Biden administration has completely lost touch with the idea of hiring and firing people according to their performance and the work that they do, and instead wants to base those decisions on a person's immutable characteristics and achieving quotas in the name of equity. My amendment will hold these individuals accountable to simply do their jobs instead of promoting a radical agenda and wasting taxpayer dollars, again, dollars that are borrowed from our kids and our grandkids. And I urge my colleagues to vote in support of my amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to request a recorded vote.
Recorded pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia will be postponed. It is now in order to consider amendment number 29, printed in Part F of House Report 118-216. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 29, printed in Part F of House Report number 118-216, offered by Mr. Biggs of Arizona.
Pursuant to House Resolution 723, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of my amendment, which restores funding for the National Agricultural Statistical Service to the fiscal year 2019 level. That would result in directly nearly $13 million to deficit reduction in fiscal year 2024. Annual discretionary spending, I won't go through that again. What I said last time. Revenue in fiscal year 2022 levels actually exceeded our federal spending in fiscal year 2019, meaning that if we were to shrink the federal behemoth back to those pre-COVID levels, we might be able to avoid adding to our national debt for the next 12 months. Now, I want to continue on why this is so doggone important that we take care of this. Because my proposed funding level for the National Agricultural Statistical Service is a 7.5% increase over fiscal year 2019 level. So you actually, we're bumping it above, slightly above the 2019 level, but we're getting right back to the pre-COVID levels. Now let's talk about this for a second. My colleagues across the aisle, I actually heard one of them say in talking about the underlying bill, the main bill, that the federal government needed to, quote, meet the needs of every American, close quote. I want you to think about what that says. The federal government meets the need of every American. Who determines what that need is? And who pays for that need? Well, no, our grandchildren must be the ones that they think are going to pay for the current needs, because we are borrowing $2 trillion this year, and it'll be more than that next year. We're paying interest about $700 billion in 2023. It'll be more than that next year. And let's talk about the Fed again. I would mention the Fed just so people could understand that the Fed has now put itself in a precarious position. We always used the Fed. We counted on it. Those who wanted to grow government anyways did. They believed in modern monetary theory, that the Fed could just keep printing money, no inflation would result, it just money grows on trees, and that we could supply every American for every need that they might have. So you used the central bank to keep interest rates really low. That made private borrowers really happy about that because they could service government debt inexpensively. But what happened? COVID happened, right? And trillions of dollars flooded our economy. And when those trillions of dollars flooded our economy, it devalued our currency and caused inflation to go up because those were non-productive dollars. And what did the Democrats do last year besides doing because they didn't get their act together on budgeting? They passed a couple of CRs, which led ultimately to the omnibus bill. And that flooded money in there after COVID was long gone. They added to the inflationary pressures. And I'm going to continue this, but for now I'm going to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
I claim time in opposition to this amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. It would cut funding for the National Agricultural Statistics Service and the Census of Agriculture by an additional 8%. The bill already cuts too much funding from USDA, and any further cuts, again, make a bad bill worse. The Office of National Agricultural Statistics Service and the Census of Agriculture, those are very, very important functions, and the American people need to know. We need to know what we grow. We need to know who's producing what we grow. We need to know where it's made. We need to know what the country will need. This provides very, very important data that informs us. It informs our governmental entities, it informs our private sector, it informs the consumers. We don't need any more cuts here. So I urge you to defeat this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's talk some more about the Fed and why we're in a world of hurt and why we have to start reducing spending and funding. We can't fund every project, everything around the world, and even in our own country. We send hundreds of billions of dollars out of this country. But guess what? When the Fed bought $4.7 trillion in additional assets, $2.5 trillion of that was in mortgage-backed securities, and they invested in long-term loans. And then they kept increasing, as inflation pressures up, they kept increasing the prime rate. They're now expecting another increase in the interest rate within the next 2 months. We will have to pay that debt service. That will contribute to the inflationary pressure that we have. So when you screw up your energy policy and you screw up your federal funding policy, the American people suffer. And they suffer through higher costs due to inflation. That's a hidden tax. That's why I keep trying to find ways, line items, where we can actually provide services, but we can reduce the federal spending to at least make some rational nod towards bringing us back to some sound funding policy, something we haven't seen here in ages. Yield back.
On the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona, those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to request a recorded vote on this amendment.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona will be postponed. The chair understands that amendment number 32 will not be offered. It is now in order to consider amendment number 33, printed in Part F of House Report 118-216. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 33, printed in Part F of House Report number 118-216, offered by Mr. Biggs of Arizona.
Pursuant to House Resolution 723, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of my amendment to restore funding to the National Institute of Food and Agriculture to fiscal year 2019 levels. This amendment would direct $157 million to deficit reduction in fiscal year 2024. Let's talk about this. I've been talking all night about the precarious position our economy is in. I'm often baffled by this. I view it as an existential threat. And you know what? Bipartisan, we have seen national security leaders of this country say our biggest threat is our national debt. Every year we have a structural deficit. This year we thought it was going to be about 1.7. CBO revised it up north of $2 trillion. And that's what it's going to be next year. The National Institute of Food and Agriculture has made a habit of disseminating grant funding to organizations intent on perpetuating societal division in the United States. These include things like a $350,000 funding grant to a Soros-funded nonprofit promoting, quote, equity in community food development projects. Another $1.4 million in funds for organizations to advance food justice in California, and funding to colleges seeking to enhance diversity in food economics. And the proposed funding level that is made for the National Institute of Food and Agriculture is a 17% increase over the fiscal year 2019 level. The reduction I propose in my amendment would ensure that taxpayer dollars are properly focused on activities related to food and crop development. That's what this agency is supposed to be doing, not wokeifying the money that we give to it. Well, I want everyone to support this amendment, and I'm going to continue my talk about our precarious position, which is an existential crisis to the United States, and I'll reserve.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
I claim the time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I rise in very strong opposition to this amendment. Cutting funding for the National Institute of Food and Agriculture by an additional 17% is penny-wise and pound-foolish. The bill already guts funding for USDA, but the NIFA, the National Institute for Food and Agriculture, provides grants for research to our colleges and universities, and particularly the 1890 institutions that were created under the Second Morrill Act. This is a very, very useful agency. It provides essential research, the tool that keeps American agriculture on the cutting edge. In America, we produce the safest, the highest quality food and fiber anywhere in the industrialized world, and we do it because we fund research. Our research is the cutting edge. Why would we cut by 17%? We need research like we never needed it before. With the climate challenges that we're facing, we've got challenges that we must have in order to continue to produce the food to feed the people in this country and around the world. This research is essential, and we need to continue to fund it, and we don't need this 17% cut. I urge the defeat of this amendment. Let's defeat this. Let's pass a useful bill that is responsible, that meets the needs of the American people, the American producers. I urge that this be defeated, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Over the course of this evening, under the underlying bill, the debate that was going, the underlying bill was referred to as being heartless and disrespectful. This amendment was referred to as being disrespectful, as a matter of fact. But this is what I would tell you. You know what's heartless? Heartless is putting our nation and wrapping it up with flaxen cords that we will not soon be able to get out of with constant, perpetual debt. You see inflation. Inflation is going to keep going. Inflation is going to keep going because we don't have a great energy policy, and we have a terrible federal spending problem. We heard on the underlying bill, hey, you know what? We should just raise more taxes. That's what we should be doing. But you know what? We had record revenue. And guess what? We continued to increase our structural deficit, which leads to a greater national debt problem. It isn't that Americans aren't paying enough in taxes. It's a fundamental spending problem. And it gets back to what I've been talking about, this modern monetary theory. You heard it just a minute ago. We need to take care of the needs of everybody. We need to take care of the needs of everybody. Who pays for that? It is obviously not going to be the American people who are living right now. Maybe it is going to be some who are living now. We can't fundamentally afford the government that my leftist colleagues across the aisle continue to promote. That's what they want. They want massive government. They want government that controls every aspect of everybody's life, and then they say that will meet the needs of everybody. But that's not enough. They got to open the southern border as well, so that by the time the Biden administration leaves, you will have 10 million encounters at the border. And that won't include the gotaways, both known and unknown, which already, under the Biden administration, exceed 2.5 million people. Yeah, how are you going to pay for that? They never want to tell you how they're going to pay for it because they have no concept of what is facing this country. I urge the adoption of my amendment. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona will be postponed. The chair understands that amendment number 36 will not be offered. It is now in order to consider amendment number 38, printed in Part F of House Report 118.216. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 38, printed in Part F of House Report number 118-216, offered by Mr. Biggs of Arizona.
Pursuant to House Resolution 723, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of my amendment to restore funding to the Farm Production and Conservation Business Center to fiscal year 2019 levels. That's right, take it back to pre-COVID levels. This amendment would direct nearly $15 million to deficit reduction in fiscal year 2024. My staff and I earlier in the year introduced many bills trying to take a line item approach to the budget to try to reduce spending, try to bring us back into some rationality, and this is one of the places we found. The proposed funding level for the Farm Production and Conservation Business Center is a nearly 7% increase over fiscal year 2019 levels. The Farm Production and Conservation Business Center is a fairly new office within the Department of Agriculture and is intended to support the agency's farmer-facing components. But under the Biden administration, the agency is pushing out taxpayer-funded climate alarmism and messaging to outline how USDA is advancing equity by providing increased financial assistance to historically underserved groups. The spending reduction in this amendment would ensure that the business center is not abusing its farmer-facing role to promote divisive ideology as the Biden regime is trying to do, but instead focuses its resources on serving agricultural producers. I'm going to reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. What purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Claim time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Listen, these amendments just go to undermine the ability of USDA to do what it's supposed to do for the American people. This is another amendment that cuts funding, and if you keep cutting funding, you will totally make this agency unable to deliver on its promises to the American people. It's a bad amendment. It's a cut that doesn't need to happen. I urge its opposition, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to say, I'm actually baffled a little bit because I never hear from across the aisle like we're on the other side of an ocean. An ocean separates us. I never hear my colleagues say that they want to reduce spending on any program. I just never hear it. Instead, they want to continually propose big spending programs that we simply don't have money for. And then they want to do something that's actually self-defeating by increasing taxes. We have significant revenue. We just outspend the revenue. We just outspend it every time. So what happened after COVID? Well, I'm proposing we go back to pre-COVID levels. But what happened during COVID is that the Federal Reserve had to auction so many treasuries, it actually had to begin offering higher rates. What did that do? That fueled higher rates. Now with rates so much higher, the bank is now forced to borrow against all its prior lending, all its prior investments, which they did at like 1%. And now we're sitting at 5.3%. And when you're doing bonds, Mr. Chairman, and you know this as well as anybody, your value of your asset has decreased. That's what's happened. That's what happened. And it puts us in massive economic jeopardy. We have to acknowledge that. And that's the reason that the Fed has incurred a net loss of $53.5 billion on interest expense, a trend that's going to continue in this quarter. And I'm going to submit for the record an article by Daniel Horowitz of this date with this information. And then let's talk some more about what should be done. What should be done. Yeah, would you, yeah.
In the record.
Yeah, thank you.
Under general leave.
Thank you. With our structure, we have a structural deficit of $2 trillion. We're spending $700 billion in interest. Fed's losing money. Our economy is slowing down to boot. So the question is, what could we do? How about we rein in our federal spending so that the value of our currency doesn't keep dropping like a stone? How about we unleash American energy so that we have cost pressure to reduce costs on the energy side, and we have traditional currency protection on the inflation side? That would do it. That would help. But we don't see anything from the Hill from which my colleagues across the way speak. We don't hear it from the White House either. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I am urging adoption of this amendment. It's a small measure to reduce a small program in a small way, but it moves us in that direction. I'll yield.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. He's Texas. Oklahoma. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oklahoma seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
It's now in order to. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 41, printed in Part F of House Report number 118-216, offered by Mr. Burkeen of Oklahoma.
It is now in order to consider, pursuant to House Resolution 723, the gentleman from Oklahoma will, and a member opposed to it will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since this administration took office, the average family of 4 is spending $1,200 more per month to buy the exact same goods and services as they were compared to January of 2021. That is a almost $15,000 increase per year to the average family of four. It's because of excessive government spending that is driving devaluation of our currency, thus inflation. I grew up ranching, and I still ranch. When you talk to farmers and ranchers, they'll tell you their biggest issue is the increase in the input costs. Whether it's 4-point barbed wire, whether it's T-posts, whether it's a feed truck, cake box, used tractors, everything is costing almost twice what it did just a few years ago. The price of agriculture in general is up 23%, the stats tell us, just in 2 years under this administration. To help America's farmers and ranchers, we need to get serious about cutting government spending that is the root cause of inflation and that devaluation of our currency. Right now, for every dollar that we're spending, above $6 trillion in spend, only 70% of it's paid for. We're charging 30% to our kids and our grandkids who want to inherit those farms and ranches. My conservative colleagues and I are urging Congress to reduce overall spending back to pre-COVID spending levels. The cut I'm proposing with this amendment is a modest 6.5% cut from the underlying bill. Funds at NRCS at a higher level even than they were at fiscal year 19. I know NRCS programs. In my heavy equipment excavation business, I built ponds. I have friends that work for NRCS. I have gotten good advice from NRCS. My question is to my friends in NRCS, my question to my friends in agriculture, in the agricultural community, can we not return to the pre-COVID spending levels to give our kids and our grandkids a chance at the blessing of liberty? There is money within the NRCS that can be cut that's not even conservation related. Like many agencies, the Biden administration is using even NRCS to carry out a leftist agenda. So absorption of these cuts should start here. NRCS has an equity division whose mission is to advocate and better align institutional equity into the work practices of NRCS programs and services. NRCS aims to meet or exceed President Biden's Justice 40 goals. Under the guise of environmental justice, the Justice 40 initiative goal is to pick winners and losers. It aims to have 40% of benefits flow to disadvantaged communities that are marginalized, underserved, and overburdened by pollution, end of quote. NRCS state offices like Vermont have created a lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, special emphasis program manager position. NRCS also provides resources such as pride calendars, pronouns in the workplace guidance, and LGBTQ spotlights. This is not the role. This is not the original mission of NRCS. It demonstrates there is excess within the agency. I know this agency. I've benefited from it. Friends have benefited from it. But if we are going to be serious about giving our kids a chance, we can't protect every program that we like from what has to be a nation that starts living within its means. We have to begin somewhere. This 6.5% cut is more than reasonable, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
In opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. Cutting funding for the National Resources Conservation Service by an additional 8% will just, again, make it worse. This is a very, very, very important agency. It provides very valuable services to our communities as well as to our farmers. You've got a number of programs that are so vitally important. You got the conservation innovation programs. You've got the environmental quality incentives program, which helps farmers and ranchers and forest landowners to integrate conservation into their working lands. You got the grants that support the development of new tools and new approaches, practices, and technologies to further our natural resource conservation on private lands. You've got the conservation stewardship programs, which builds on conservation efforts to strengthen the farmers' operations. You got the Emergency Watershed Protection Program, which is a federal emergency recovery program that helps local communities to recover after natural disaster strike. Look at what we've endured over the past year. The past 2 years, communities have been struck by floods, by wildfires, by hurricanes. We've got problems, and the watershed rehabilitation program is there, and it needs to be fully funded, particularly this year with what we've experienced with the climate change. You got the watershed and the flood prevention programs. Time and time again, the wetland reserve easements. We've got to help this. We have to protect our forest, and of course, the forest programs, the grazing funds for our livestock. You know, this is just penny wise and pound foolish again. We must protect the conservation programs because they protect our environment and they protect our farmers and help them to be sustainable. This is a bad amendment. I urge its rejection, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had someone say to me one time, governing should be pretty easy. However much government you want ought to be the amount of government you're willing to pay for. The problem is on the federal government level, we're not paying for it. We're asking our kids and our grandkids to pay for all of this. For every dollar we are spending right now, we are asking our children to pick up 30% of the tab. And so the question is, when will we start being responsible, looking out for the blessing of liberty for our children and our grandkids? This is a 6.5% reduction. The underlying bill, if adopted, leaves $850 million unto NRCS. We are addicted. We are addicted to our overspend in this nation. And so fiscal sanity is crying out. Future generations are crying out. Start somewhere. And I'm asking my colleagues to start here with me.
Does the gentleman yield back?
He does.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Oklahoma. All those in favor say aye. Any opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to.
I requested.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
I'd like to demand a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceeding on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Oklahoma will be postponed. The gentleman will suspend. The chair understands that amendment number 42 will not be offered. It is now in order to consider amendment number 43, printed in Part F of House Report 118-216. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oklahoma seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Amendment is pending at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 43, printed in Part F of House Report number 118-216, offered by Mr. Brakeen of Oklahoma.
Pursuant to House Resolution 723, the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Breachin, and the member opposed to the amendment will each control 5 minutes. The clerk now recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To reiterate what's been said this evening often, we hit $33 trillion. It's the first time in our nation's history. That means as of today, every baby that's born in any hospital around this country who opens their eyes and takes in their first breath of air owes $98,000. And they're only going to pay it off through a lower standard of living because of the selfishness of the generations before them. If we continue at this rate of overspending, we are sacrificing their future. Make no mistake about that. That's why my conservative colleagues and I are trying to rein in our federal spending and return to the pre-COVID spending levels. We have to start cutting spending. My amendment would eliminate the USDA Rental Assistance Program, which was one of 25 duplicative housing programs. I want to reiterate the word duplicative. Duplicative housing programs, 25. This amendment, if adopted, would save $1.6 billion. That's real numbers. Today, the federal government subsidizes low-income families through more than 25 duplicative housing programs consisting of projects, vouchers, rental construction, financing, grants to state and local governments. It includes 20 different entities administering 160 different programs, tax expenditures, and other tools supporting home ownership and rental housing. In 2021, The federal government spent over $57 billion on low-income housing programs benefiting 9.3 million Americans. We have 333 million Americans total in this nation. This particular program represents only about 2.8% of federal housing assistance programs. This duplicative program should be rolled under the Department of Housing and Urban Development to improve efficiency. In 2012 and 2016 reports, the Government Accountability Office recommended consolidating many of these programs, duplicative programs. That is why in 2018, OMB under President Trump proposed moving USDA rental housing programs to HUD to improve operational efficiency, service delivery, produce savings by reducing agency bureaucracy cost. According to the OMB under the Trump administration, quote, USDA housing programs, which serve eligible rural areas, were initially established in the 1940s in response to an underrepresentation of national housing programs in rural areas. Since then, the rationale for separate rural-focused housing programs at USDA has become outdated, giving HUD's role in serving communities throughout the nation, including many in rural areas. In fact, due in large part to the sheer size of its programs, HUD serves more households in USD-eligible areas than USDA does, end of quote. The GAO found, quote, the consolidation of agencies or administrative functions could yield a more efficient oversight and administrative structure for cost savings in central housing programs. The Government Accountability Office recommended that HUD and USDA review, consolidate duplicative housing programs, including rural housing service. The duplication of program services provides headaches and confusions to the neediest of Americans, wanting to know where to go. It's time to streamline programs and get our fiscal house in order. What is causing so many young adults outside of this program administration not to be able to afford their homes? High interest rates driven by overspending. This $1.6 billion that this amendment proposes represents a return to fiscal sanity. For every dollar we're spending, we're only paying for 70% of it. When are we going to get serious about spending restraint for the next generation? I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from, for what purpose is the gentleman from Georgia
I claim
seek
time in
recognition?
opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
This bill, our funding bill, funds rural America. We as members of Congress ought to be committed to assuring that people who live in rural communities are not disadvantaged simply because of their rural zip code. I urge us to defeat this amendment because housing, affordable, decent housing, is something that every American ought to have access to regardless of where he or she lives. And of course, this funding for rural America is comparable to the same programs that urban Americans have access to. It provides support for families so that they can afford to have decent housing. To cut this is to really to punish people who need the help for decent housing who happen to live in rural America. This is something we should not do. Rural Americans should have the same opportunities to realize the American dream as any other American, any place they live. And so I urge the defeat of this amendment. It's bitter, it's a nasty amendment that hurts people who need a hand up. And so I urge that this amendment be defeated.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In closing, I just want to reiterate, duplication of programming, there are 25 duplicative programs in the same area. This cut represents 2.8% of all federal housing assistance. We can help the neediest Americans by streamlining housing programs and getting our own fiscal house in order. I urge my colleagues to support this common sense reduction in duplication. And I yield.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Oklahoma. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
I'd like to request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Oklahoma will be postponed. It is now in order to consider amendment number 45, printed in Part F of House Report 118216. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 45, printed in Part F of House Report number 118-216, offered by Mr. Perry of Pennsylvania.
Pursuant to House Resolution 723, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment cuts this account, the Rural Business Program account, in half from last year's enacted budget amount of $43,125,000. Now, though the Rural Business Cooperative Service, like a lot of Washington, D.C. programs, has a good name, it doesn't always do good things. Unfortunately, it continues the age-old government sin of picking winners and losers instead of just letting the market work. Small businesses, I ran a small business, and people would tell me, well, the government wants to be a good partner. I wasn't looking for a partner in my business. I was looking to run my business, and if it was a partner, surely it wasn't the government, who had no idea about what I did in my business. What businesses need is for the government to get out of the way and stop making it difficult if they don't bend the knee to whatever the government demands of them. Now, let me just tell you what we're funding with this money. This comes right from the code cited in this appropriations bill. Loans for the purposes of reducing the reliance on non-renewable energy sources by encouraging the development and construction of solar energy systems and other renewable energy systems. So if you want to do that, you can get some of this money. If you don't want to do that, you can forget it. Ladies and gentlemen, we've seen the government-mandated shift to green and oftentimes unreliable energy resources or sources, and we've seen what it's done to the country. I mean, the Secretary of Energy tried to take a drive a little while ago in her battery-operated vehicle and didn't make it too far. We're not against these things, but the market should decide, not the government. The government is not the market, and it doesn't make the most efficient decisions. Even in places where the shift hasn't directly caused tragedy, every single one of our constituents are facing higher prices because of these policies. And ladies and gentlemen, because of these policies, we're literally building a grid on top of the grid that we already have, and the grid that we have, we're actually diminishing. At the very same time, we're demanding more from that grid. You remember your health care costs, how they were going to go down when we socialized medicine with the Affordable Care Act, and now you can't afford medicine? Well, get ready, because you're not going to be able to afford your electricity either. This program supports that unaffordability, which is why it should end. And this is only the tip of the iceberg. This very spending fight has highlighted the true amount of waste and duplication in the federal government the gentleman before me just spoke about. So I want to offer a list of the agencies that offer direct or indirect funding for this very thing. Department of Agriculture, Department of Commerce, Department of Defense, Department of Housing and Urban Development, Department of Interior, Department of Treasury, and Small Business Administration. My goodness, if every household and every business duplicated all the things the federal government did, well, they'd be broke too, because we sure are now, ladies and gentlemen. Again, I'm more than supportive of small businesses in towns. That's where I got my start, picking fruit, baling hay, working in small businesses. First business outside of agriculture was Ray's Exxon on Route 15. That's a small business. These businesses, like every other one, and our consumers have faced the record high cost of living due to government-mandated shutdowns and harmful Biden policies. Every single one of these businesses and individual taxpayers, all taxpayers, ought to keep more of their money that they earn, instead of having it redistributed to whoever the government chooses to be the winner. Mr. Chairman, I urge support of this amendment, and I reserve the balance.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
In opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
This amendment should be defeated. It will cut funding for the Rural Business Cooperative Service by an additional 44%. Agricultural cooperatives provide effective marketing, low-cost supplies, and services to their member owners. And cooperatives bring electricity, e-connectivity, affordable housing, capital, financial services, telecommunications, healthcare, food, hardware, building supplies, and countless other goods and services to people who live in rural communities. Just the example for electricity. There are 900 co-ops, electric membership corporations, that serve 42 million people in this country, in 48 of the 50 states, and they cover 51% of the land area in the United States of America. We need the Rural Business Cooperative Service to help support these rural co-ops that help bring business and help marketing in our rural communities. Agriculture is a very, very lucrative business. It happens in our rural communities for the most part, and we need this cooperative service and we need the support for it. This is a bad amendment. It's, again, penny-wise, pound foolish. I urge its defeat. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield 1 minute to the great gentleman from the state of Maryland.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, I want to thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania for coming to the floor with a specific idea of how we stop the out-of-control federal spending leading to a $2 trillion deficit and runaway inflation. That's the bottom line. Look, there are plenty of ideas on how to spend more money. Believe you me, plenty of ideas circulating around Washington. What we need are ideas how to cut spending. And, Mr. Chair, I suggest that going after parts of the federal government that encourage high-cost energy, because that's what renewable energy is. It's all high cost. That's the fact of the matter. If we want to create low energy, Mr. Chair, you know what we got to do? We got to extract our natural gas, and we burn our natural gas, and then we can compete with China for the cost of energy. All that we're doing with programs like this that fund renewable energy is unilateral disarmament to China on energy. And it doesn't belong in the Agriculture Department. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized. The gentleman from Pennsylvania's time is also expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia rise?
Mr. Chair, I demand a recorded vote on this.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 48, printed in Part F of House Report 118216. For what purpose does the gentleman from Iowa now seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to discuss the critical need to expand broadband connectivity.
Gentleman will suspend. Does the gentleman have an amendment at the desk?
I do.
Is it number 48?
It is.
Good. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 48, printed in Part F of House Report number 118-216, offered by Mr. Nunn of Iowa.
Pursuant to House Resolution 723, the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Nunn, will control, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Iowa.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I rise today to speak about broadband connectivity across the United States. In my home state of Iowa, nearly a third of our state is considered a broadband desert. Hundreds of thousands of Iowans are left out from the critical access that they need for a young mother to get telemedicine provided, for a growing farmer to be able to have the artificial intelligence necessary for their farm to be successful, or for a fellow veteran to get the type of access they need for their medicine over broadband. As a parent, we know all too well the challenges of rural communities to be able to get the same access that some of our other states have received. It is not enough to simply have internet, but to have high-quality access to broadband that truly grows the types of communities that we've seen be successful, not just in my home state of Iowa, but across the country. These small investments allow young entrepreneurs to work remote. They allow farmers to work and cultivate to both feed and fuel the world. And importantly, they help connect through the USDA's Reconnect program, grants that allow access to grow in my home state to over 400,000 households, not just in Iowa, but nationwide. Clearly, there is more work that needs to be done. I offered this amendment in the agricultural appropriations legislation to raise the awareness and the need that's happening in rural communities across our country, and to improve this program to ensure that we're investing in our rural community success in the same way we have in some of our large cities' success. Strategically speaking, though, I want to make sure that this is something that is enduring, and not just in one appropriations bill, but that there's a rollout plan. A plan like the Farm Bill that looks at a 5-year venture here. And so with that, with Chairman G.T. Thompson's commitment on the Ag Committee, I believe that we can incorporate this into the Farm Bill, and I would like to withdraw my amendment and yield time to the Chairman of the Ag Committee.
Does the gentleman seek to reserve his time?
I do.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
In opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. During this Congress, the House Committee on Agriculture has had one overarching goal: to empower our farm families and invigorate our rural economies. A central focus of our efforts has been to ensure that rural economies gain access to affordable, high-speed internet. I want to thank Mr. Nunn for his tireless work on behalf of his constituents to develop smart policy ideas to bring broadband internet to every corner of America. Over the past several years, the House Committee on Agriculture has worked hard on a bipartisan basis to close the connectivity gap. The gentleman from Iowa has been a welcome addition to those conversations. Every member of this House is committed to using taxpayer funds wisely, and the House Ag Committee will report a farm bill that does just that. We will ensure that broadband networks financed through USDA's broadband programs will offer fast, reliable service far into the future. Now, I firmly believe that the best policies emerge through discussion and collaboration, and that is what we are doing as we craft the next Farm Bill. With the leadership of members like Mr. Nunn, we will ensure USDA's broadband programs can meet both the current and the future connectivity needs of rural America. I appreciate him taking the time tonight to raise this important issues. I'm equally appreciative of his willingness to withdraw his amendment and continue this conversation through the Farm Bill process. And I look forward to priorities as we advance the 2023 Farm Bill through the House and ultimately to the President's desk. And so thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back.
Member reclaims.
The gentleman from Iowa is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to specifically thank Chairman Thompson for his leadership on this, for the many of us from rural communities, including ag communities like Iowa, for this continued commitment to improve our broadband. We have seen time and time again this type of infrastructure truly can grow our economy in a productive way. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to withdraw my amendment from consideration.
Without objection, the amendment is withdrawn. It is now in order to consider amendment number 51, printed in Part F of House Report 118-216. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to offer.
Does the gentleman have an amendment at the desk?
Yes, I have an amendment at the desk.
The
Mr.
clerk
Speaker.
will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 51, printed in Part F of House Report number 118-216, offered by Mr. Donalds of Florida.
Pursuant to House Resolution 723, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Donalds, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Listen, I will be brief. My amendment does one simple thing. It actually restores the funding for the Foreign Agricultural Service to FY19 levels. In short, Mr. Speaker, our government spends a lot of money. We're not even sure if it's really effective. And one of the things that is critical to get our overall fiscal house in order is start to look at line items in the federal budget pre-COVID. And so we've plussed up a lot of these agencies and a lot of these departments, and the COVID pandemic was used as a reason to do so. My amendment is simple. The COVID pandemic is over. It is now time to start focusing on getting the fiscal house in order while still being focused on the programs that are important to the agriculture community and other communities. My amendment does that, and with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
I claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I certainly rise in opposition to this amendment. The amendment will reduce funding for the Foreign Agriculture Service, which reduces the services promoting United States agricultural exports, developing overseas markets, and increasing global food security. This cut would directly harm American farmers because they would have less opportunities to market their commodities abroad. There's already a 14.15% cut from the House levels imposed by the majority in this bill, and these cuts would only further harm our American farmers. I urge opposition to this amendment and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, let's be very clear. What we're talking about is moving the requested number for this appropriation down $23.4 million. In 2019, we spent $213,890 on the Foreign Agriculture Service. All we're saying is moving back to that line. The federal government will still be able to accomplish its mission, but we don't have the additional resources. We have to be prudent with the people's money so we can actually cut back to 19 levels and still accomplish the mission. And with that, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Maryland.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Look, I want to congratulate the member from Florida for bringing a concrete idea to the floor on how to cut our $2 trillion federal deficit. Once again, it's very easy to spend money. We could make a list of 1,000 programs that are deserving programs. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Chair, we have to borrow every single cent to fund the programs in this agriculture bill. And our grandchildren have to pay it back. That's immoral. I yield back.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Yes, I think it's interesting to hear the discussion about a $2 trillion deficit when that was created by the tax cut that they passed in that last administration. $2 trillion because they cut the taxes and reduced the amount of revenue. Come on. You know, you balance the budget with revenues as well as with spending reductions. Let's be real here. This is just a subterfuge. We need to defeat this amendment, and we need to move forward and try to produce an agriculture bill that really addresses the needs of the American people in 2023. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Florida is recognized for remaining 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I did not hear an argument as to why $250 million needs to be spent for the Foreign Agriculture Service. What I heard, Mr. Speaker, was talk about the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which, by the way, has yielded more tax revenue to the federal government than at any other time in American history. The minority party refuses to acknowledge the fact that actual tax policy changes in a positive way, which reduces rates on producers in our country, actually yields more tax revenue to the federal government. They refuse to acknowledge that to this day. If you're going to ask a recipe for fiscal sanity in this nation, it is actually lower marginal tax rates over a consistent period of time. Consistent, controlled spending restraint at the federal level over a period of time. Those two things will actually yield us to spending less in this government and provide more prosperity to all of the people that we serve, regardless of where they fall on the economic ladder. Mr. Speaker, I ask my colleagues to support this amendment. This is what we should be doing, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. All those in favor say aye. Any opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The chair understands that amendment number 52 will not be offered. The chair understands that amendment 53 will not be offered. It is now in order to consider amendment number 54 printed in Part F of House Report 118-216. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 54, printed in Part F of House Report number 118-216, offered by Mr. Biggs of Arizona.
Pursuant to House Resolution 723, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arizona.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Chairman would be fine.
Yeah, I thought so, but you are speaking, so. Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of my amendment to strike funding for the Food for Peace Title II grant program, which would direct $1.74 billion to deficit reduction. I will repeat again what has been said so often here. Annual discretionary spending exploded over the course of the COVID-19 response. No one thought our government was too small before COVID, and we're currently spending $400 billion more in fiscal year 2023 for the same government we had before. Deficits exceed $2 trillion. And let me just make this clear. 2019, we spent about $4.9 trillion, 4.7 to 4.9 trillion. It depends on who's telling you. And our revenue is going to be about $5.2 trillion. Wouldn't it be great to get back to those 2019 levels? Wouldn't it be great to get to those 2019 spending levels with our current revenue levels? Then you would not be increasing your deficit, your structural deficit. These spending deficits that we have are out of control. They're leading to this massive national debt, which is fueling inflation and going to be generational theft. So let's talk about the Food for Peace Title II grant programs. Since the program was established in the 1950s, funding for the program has exploded. The Trump administration's fiscal year 2020 budget request recommended eliminating this program, which is duplicative of other foreign aid programs. And you know what's interesting? I say Trump, and you know that's going to set, oh no, the Trump derangement syndrome folks, the far left of this body are going to go, oh, that's crazy. But it wasn't Trump. Trump wasn't the first to do it. The Obama administration's 2014 budget request recommended shifting all Food for Peace Title II funds into accounts funded through the State and Foreign Appropriations Bill. They cited potential improvements to flexibility, timeliness, and efficiency. I'm urging us to wipe out $1.74 billion in wasteful, duplicative spending and put it into deficit reduction. I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
I claim the time in opposition.
The gentleman claims the time in opposition. He's recognized for 5 minutes.
I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. As a reminder, the bill already cuts the Food for Peace program by 69% from the level passed in the full committee. During a time of increased need and difficult decisions ahead for prioritizing funding from this program, this amendment would further cut Food for Peace. Additionally, today we've already considered 3 other standalone amendments to cut the program. I not only oppose this amendment due to its effects on people without food security across the globe, I also oppose it due to its effect on our farmers here at home. U.S. commodities are a key pillar of this program, and cutting funding would directly harm those farmers who produce these commodities that go to this program. There is an international aid shortfall of commodities, including many of the commodities that American farmers proudly produce, such as wheat, rice, corn, sorghum, lentils, beans, and peas. This amendment shortchanges America's farmers, as well as America's values, our Judeo-Christian values. I urge opposition to this amendment. Thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, previously, some of my counterparts in debate have said we should supply every need. The federal government should supply every need to every American. And now they want to persist in trying to satisfy the needs and wants of people offshore as well. We can't afford to take care of every need of every American today. That's why you have a $2 trillion structural deficit. That does not include the $700 billion that we're spending in interest. We simply cannot afford to keep giving our future away, and that's what we're doing here. I'm going to reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Georgia. Does the gentleman?
I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Arizona may close.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'm encouraging everyone to support this important amendment. I think it's important, and I'll yield back the remainder.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona. All those in favor say aye. Any opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is not or is agreed to.
Mr. Chair, I
For what
request a
purpose does the
recorded
gentleman
vote.
from Georgia seek recognition?
I request a recorded
The gentleman
vote.
requests the yeas and nays, recorded vote. Pursuant to Rule 6 of Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on this amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona will be postponed. The chair understands that amendment number 55 will not be offered. The chair further understands that it is now in order to consider amendment number 56, printed in Part F of House Report 118-216. For what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 56, printed in Part F of House Report number 118-216, offered by Mr. Ogles of Tennessee.
Pursuant to House Resolution 723, the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Ogles, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our nation's international food assistance programs are broken. They drive our deficits higher while providing little to no value to taxpayers and even harming the recipient countries. I am grateful for Rep. Harris's manager's amendment that reduced funding for the destructive so-called Food for Peace program, and I urge extending the cost cuts to its sister program, McGovern-Dole, sometimes known as Food for Education. When we dump free food on developing markets, their domestic farmers can't compete. I mean, who can compete with free? Their domestic farmers are forced out of business, and investment in their domestic agricultural sector dwindles. In fact, we hurt those we seek to assist. And we've known that this problem has existed for years. In 2010, watching international food aid destroy his country's agricultural sector, the president of Haiti begged us to stop sending it. Further, reflecting on his administration's role in testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, President Bill Clinton said, "I've had to live every day with the consequences of the loss of capacity to produce a rice crop in Haiti to feed the people." Bill Clinton even recognized the mistake. But then we keep making it. We need to stop impoverishing farmers in countries with developing agricultural sectors and stop discouraging private investment in those sectors. While supporters of the McGovern-Dole program have touted its alleged role supporting democracy and good governance, a look at the recipient countries proves that that isn't true. USDA determines a list of priority countries for McGovern-Dole each year. This year's recipients, 7 countries: Nicaragua, which is ruled by Daniel Ortega's thugocracy, throws its opposition in prison, and that's on a good day. It stands accused of politically motivated extrajudicial executions and torture and other human rights abuses. Then there's Togo, whose president first took power in a military coup in 2005. Cameroon's president coincidentally won re-election uninterrupted, since coming into power in 1982. At the time, the USDA put Nepal on the priority list. It had a Communist Party leader. These are not beacons of democracy or good governance. Haiti still remains on the priority list. And look at Haiti today. Decades of aid have failed to produce a reliable government there. I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Georgia. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
I rise in Opposition?
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. As I said in my opening statement, this bill already cuts the agriculture funding bill back to a level last seen in 2001. Apparently, those cuts are not enough because this amendment would cut 50% from the McGovern-Dole International Food Program for Education. That's 50% cut from funding supporting school children abroad. This is a proven successful program, a bipartisan program, which takes concrete steps to ensure that the program activities continue after U.S. support is no longer provided. This money is not wasted, it's not indefinite for any one location. It's a sound investment to promote the health and education of school children, especially girls in need around the globe. We're 4 days away from a government shutdown, and instead of debating a bipartisan path forward, we're debating further cuts to programs that have broad bipartisan support. I urge all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to vote against this amendment. Thank you. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, success? Haiti's a wreck. Nicaragua has sided with the CCP. They led the charge to expel Taiwan as a permanent observer, replacing with the butchers of Beijing. Of the 7 priority countries, 6 of them, including Cameroon, Mozambique, Nepal, Nicaragua, Sri Lanka, Togo, voted to support China's imposition of the oppressive national security law on Hong Kong. The recipient countries have proven to be anti-American. Their countries have failed to produce agricultural sectors because local farmers can't compete with free. This isn't saving people from hunger. It's destroying the very people we're trying to assist. I would urge Congress to continue to reform its food aid program. And I'll just say, Mr. Chairman, if you want to sow the seeds of freedom, harvest the yield of democracy, pursuing failed policies is not the answer. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Georgia.
I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman may close.
Mr. Chairman, I urge adoption of my amendment. These policies are failed. They are not successful. The very countries that we're aiming to support, we're hurting. Let's help these nations, but this is not the answer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Tennessee. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 57, printed in Part F of House Report 118-216. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 57, printed in Part F of House Report number 118-216, offered by Mr. Biggs of Arizona.
Pursuant to House Resolution 723, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of my amendment to strike funding for the McGovern-Dole International Food for Education and Child Nutrition Program. I appreciate that my colleague, Mr. Ogles, reducing it, and I appreciate that that's now going to be part of the underlying bill since it just passed on voice vote. But my amendment would direct the entire $240 million supporting that program that would be used to reduce our deficit in 2024. And when you think about it, Mr. Ogles certainly made a strong case as to why that should be so, but I'm going to add just a couple of points to it. I'm not going to belabor the fact that we continue to spend ourselves into oblivion at the federal level. That's causing tremendous inflationary pressures, bringing stress to every American family. What I'm going to talk about instead is what happens in any federal bureaucracy, what we see government do constantly. Mr. Ogles talked about the negative policy aspects of it, but I want to just cover briefly what happens in the federal bureaucracy on the spending side of it. This particular program, the McGovern-Dole International Food for Education and Child Nutrition Program, first received appropriations in fiscal year 2000.